Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
It was the sort of afternoon that encouraged the comforting illusion that nothing dreadful could possibly happen. Warm sunlight rested gently over the cottages of St. Mary Mead, climbing ivy glowed a rich green against old brick walls, and the church bells drifted lazily through the still air. The roses seemed unusually bright that June day, while swallows skimmed low over the village green in graceful arcs. Every familiar sight reassured the villagers that life would continue exactly as it always had. That confidence lasted until Dr. Haydock walked home. Earlier in the day, the annual church garden fete had drawn nearly everyone from the surrounding countryside. Tables overflowed with homemade cakes, preserves, embroidered linens, and flower arrangements that the competitors discussed with remarkable seriousness. Children darted between the stalls, clutching sticky buns. Elderly ladies exchanged whispered observations beneath broad hats, and the vicar did his best to persuade reluctant visitors to try their luck at the raffle. Dr. Haydock had spent most of the afternoon moving from one conversation to another. Being the village doctor meant he could scarcely take 10 steps without someone asking about an aching shoulder, a troublesome cough, or a sleepless grandchild. He accepted every interruption with patient good humor. He had practiced medicine in the district for many years and knew nearly every family history better than they knew it themselves. If anyone noticed that he occasionally glanced over his shoulder, they assumed he was searching for another patient. Only one person wondered whether those glances meant something else. Miss Marple sat quietly beneath a white canvas awning, knitting an impossibly long grey scarf despite the pleasant weather. She rarely appeared to observe anything directly. Instead, she listened with the detached expression of someone more interested in dropped stitches than overheard gossip, yet very little escaped her. She watched Dr. Haydock pause beside the lemonade table. His eyes travelled briefly toward the entrance gate before he resumed speaking to the chairman of the parish council. The movement lasted barely a second, but it reminded her of nervous robins checking hedgerows before returning to their nests. She tucked the observation away without comment. Nearby, Mrs. Price Ridley declared loudly that the strawberry jam competition had been judged unfairly for at least 6 consecutive years. Colonel Bantry laughed. It wouldn't be a proper fate if you didn't accuse someone of favoritism. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. I'm merely saying there are certain patterns. Indeed, Colonel Bantry replied. There usually are. The conversation drifted harmlessly into complaints about weather, judges, and amateur gardeners. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People loved patterns. Unfortunately, they nearly always noticed the wrong ones. As afternoon melted toward evening, visitors began carrying folding chairs back into the church hall. Prize ribbons disappeared into handbags. Unsold cakes were divided among volunteers. One by one, villagers started home along winding lanes bordered by hawthorn hedges. Dr. Haydock declined several invitations to stay for another cup of tea. I'm afraid I've paperwork waiting, he explained. Illness rarely respects holidays. He said farewell with his usual cheerful manner before setting off alone along the narrow footpath leading toward his cottage. Several people watched him leave. No one remembered seeing who left immediately afterward. That detail would become important later. About 15 minutes passed. The fete continued to dissolve into a comfortable disorder. Then the first strange remark arrived. Young Peter Simmons, who had wandered farther down the lane chasing a cricket ball, returned looking unusually serious. I think somebody's following the doctor. Adults barely looked up. Children imagined all sorts of things. His mother brushed dust from his sleeves. Don't invent stories. But I saw someone. You probably saw Mr. Ellis. No, the postman. Peter shook his head. I couldn't see properly. The matter ended there, or so everyone believed. Miss Marple happened to overhear the exchange. She neither questioned the boy nor interrupted the conversation. Children frequently noticed details adults dismissed simply because they lacked the habit of deciding in advance what ought to be there. She resumed knitting. An hour later, clouds gathered unexpectedly over the western hills. Though no rain fell, The sunlight faded beneath a grey veil that altered the mood of the village. Houses seemed quieter. Shadows stretched across narrow lanes. Dr. Haydock did not appear for evening choir practice. That alone was mildly unusual. He was not a particularly musical man, but he was dependable. Mrs. Finch mentioned his absence. So unlike him. He must have been delayed with a patient, someone answered. The explanation satisfied everyone, except Miss Marple. Dependable people occasionally missed appointments, certainly. But dependable people also tended to send messages. As dusk settled, a housemaid from Dr. Haydock's cottage hurried breathlessly across the green toward the vicarage. She was pale enough that conversation stopped wherever she passed. The vicar met her at the gate. "What is it?" I think something's wrong with the doctor." His front door was open, and there are muddy footprints in the hallway. The cheerful murmur of the evening vanished. Within minutes, neighbors carrying lanterns accompanied the vicar to the doctor's cottage. The front gate stood slightly ajar. One downstairs window remained open despite the cooling air. Inside, everything appeared strangely ordinary. A hat rested neatly upon its peg. Medical journals lay stacked beside an armchair. A kettle sat cold upon the stove. Only two things disturbed the comforting picture. Fresh mud marked the polished floorboards, and Dr. Haydock was nowhere to be found. The footprints suggested two different pairs of shoes had entered the house. Only one set appeared to leave. Silence settled over the hallway. No one wished to voice the obvious possibility. The village constable was summoned immediately. Neighbors searched the garden with lanterns, calling the doctor's name again and again. No answer came. Miss Marple arrived quietly among the gathering crowd, carrying no lantern herself. She stood near the gate for several moments before walking slowly up the garden path. She did not examine the footprints. She did not inspect the rooms. Instead, she looked back toward the lane leading from the church. There, almost hidden beneath the hedge where evening shadows had deepened, she noticed something so insignificant that everyone else stepped around it without a glance. A single crushed sprig of lavender. She said nothing. Instead, she folded her hands calmly together, because, in her long experience, murder often announced itself with noise, but truth almost always whispered. By sunrise, the disappearance had become the only subject anyone in St. Mary Mead cared to discuss. Curtains twitched as neighbors watched one another crossing the street, and every shopkeeper discovered fresh reasons to linger outside their doorway in hopes of hearing the latest rumor. Before breakfast had ended, there were already half a dozen different accounts of what had happened at Dr. Haydock's cottage. Some insisted he had been attacked by a desperate burglar. Others believed an escaped criminal had wandered into the village. A few whispered that the doctor himself had uncovered some dangerous secret among his patients. Every theory grew more elaborate as it passed from one listener to the next. The village constable did his best to discourage speculation, but gossip proved impossible to restrain. Officers from the county headquarters arrived shortly after 8 o'clock, carefully examining the cottage while keeping curious villagers behind the garden gate. They photographed the muddy footprints, measured the distances between them, and searched every room with methodical precision. Yet, despite all their effort, the house yielded remarkably little. There were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, and nothing valuable appeared to be missing. Inspector Wallace, who had taken charge of the inquiry, questioned the housemaid first. She explained that she had left shortly after luncheon the previous afternoon to visit her sister in the neighboring village, expecting Dr. Haydock to return home after the church fete. When she arrived that evening, the front door had been standing open exactly as she had described. Was the doctor expecting visitors? The inspector asked. "Not that I know of, sir." Any recent disagreements? He was respected by everyone. Inspector Wallace frowned. Experience had taught him that anyone described as respected by everyone usually was not. Meanwhile, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea at the Bantry's home, where conversation revolved entirely around the mystery. Colonel Bantry declared that the police would surely discover an outsider responsible before the week ended. "It has all the appearance of an intruder," he insisted. "Those footprints practically announce it." Mrs. Bantry looked doubtful. "Footprints can be made by anyone wearing boots. Surely you don't imagine one of our own neighbors is involved?" "I imagine nothing," she replied. "I'm simply saying appearances have been known to deceive." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "It is curious," she murmured. "What is?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "The front door." Colonel Bantry looked puzzled. "What about it?" "If one intended to harm the doctor secretly, leaving the front door wide open afterward seems rather untidy. Most people who commit dreadful acts prefer to delay discovery for as long as possible." The colonel considered this. "I hadn't thought of that. It reminds me," Miss Marple continued gently, "of a maid I once knew who deliberately left a cupboard door open after breaking a china plate. She wished everyone to believe she had been interrupted before she could tidy anything away. It was a little too obvious." Mrs. Bantry smiled knowingly. "You think someone wanted the scene to be interpreted in a particular way." "I merely think human beings often arrange circumstances to support the story they hope others will believe." That afternoon, Inspector Wallace continued interviewing everyone who had attended the fete. Most remembered speaking with Dr. Haydock, but their recollections of his departure varied surprisingly. One woman claimed he had seemed cheerful. Another insisted he looked preoccupied. A gardener recalled seeing him pause near the church gate, while a schoolteacher believed he had walked directly toward home without hesitation. Only young Peter Simmons repeated with confidence that someone had followed him. The inspector knelt beside the boy. "Can you describe the person?" Peter hesitated. "I only saw a dark coat disappearing around the bend." "A man, I think so." "Did you see his face?" "No." Although the description offered little practical value, Miss Marple noticed the child never exaggerated his uncertainty. He admitted only what he truly remembered, which made the small portion he did recall seem all the more trustworthy. As evening approached, another discovery unsettled the investigation. One of the officers searching the lane between the church and Dr. Haydock's cottage found the doctor's walking stick lying in a shallow ditch beneath tangled nettles. It showed no sign of damage, but the polished handle was smeared with fresh mud, as though someone had thrown it aside in haste rather than dropped it accidentally. Inspector Wallace ordered the surrounding fields searched immediately. Miss Marple, watching quietly from the roadside, found herself wondering not who had discarded the walking stick, but why anyone would bother to do so at all. That small question lingered in her mind far longer than the discovery itself, for it suggested a deliberate choice, and deliberate choices nearly always revealed more about a person than desperate actions ever could. The search extended well into the night, with lanterns moving slowly across fields and hedgerows like wandering stars. Farmers joined constables in combing meadows, calling Dr. Haydock's name until their voices grew hoarse. Every abandoned shed, wooded copse, and narrow footpath was examined. By midnight, however, the searchers had found nothing beyond trampled grass and the occasional rabbit startled from its burrow. The doctor seemed simply to have vanished. Morning brought little comfort. Instead, the mystery deepened when Inspector Wallace received a message from the doctor's solicitor. According to the solicitor, Dr. Haydock had visited his office only 3 days earlier to review his will. There had been nothing particularly unusual about the appointment, yet the timing naturally attracted the inspector's attention. People rarely consider such matters unless prompted by advancing age, failing health, or some private anxiety. The solicitor admitted that the doctor had appeared distracted. "I asked whether something was troubling him," he explained. He smiled and said, "A village doctor hears more than is good for him." I assumed he referred to gossip. Did he mention any names? No, only that some people carry old mistakes much longer than they imagine. Inspector Wallace wrote the remark into his notebook without comment. Meanwhile, the discovery spread through St. Mary Mead before luncheon. Within hours, villagers had transformed a casual observation into proof that Dr. Haydock had feared for his life. Some insisted he had received anonymous letters. Others declared he had quarreled with a wealthy patient. By afternoon, several people claimed they had noticed his unusual behavior for weeks. though none could describe anything specific. Miss Marple listened politely to each account, while saying almost nothing herself. She knew memories possessed a remarkable ability to reshape themselves after alarming events. Once people believed danger had existed, they unconsciously searched backward until they found signs that appeared to predict it. That afternoon she called upon Mrs. Finch, whose kitchen overlooked part of the lane leading from the church. "I wonder," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "whether you happened to notice many people passing after the fete." Mrs. Finch welcomed both the question and the opportunity to discuss recent events. "Oh, dozens. Did Dr. Haydock pass your window?" "Certainly, alone." Mrs. Finch frowned. "I thought so." "You thought so? Well, now that you ask, I'm not entirely sure." Miss Marple waited patiently. "I remember watching him because he tipped his hat toward old Mr. Dobson, but immediately afterward someone else walked by. A villager. I couldn't honestly say. I was carrying the teapot back to the stove." "Did the second person appear to be hurrying?" Mrs. Finch closed her eyes briefly. "Not hurrying exactly. What then? Walking with purpose." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Purpose was often more revealing than speed. On leaving the cottage, she wandered slowly along the same lane. The crushed lavender she had noticed the previous evening remained where it had fallen, though the searchers had flattened much of the surrounding grass. She bent to examine the hedge more closely. Several stems had been broken at shoulder height. Someone taller than Dr. Haydock might easily have brushed against them while standing partially concealed beside the path. She made no attempt to draw attention to the discovery. Instead, she continued walking until she reached the doctor's gate. Inspector Wallace emerged from the cottage carrying several files. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. You look tired, Inspector. I confess, I've known easier investigations." "I imagine so." He hesitated before adding, "The county officers still believe we're looking for an abduction." "And do you?" "I believe I'm looking for facts." Miss Marple approved of the answer. "The difficulty," she observed gently, "is that facts are sometimes hidden beneath assumptions." He gave a weary smile. "I've already accumulated plenty of assumptions." At that moment, one of the younger constables hurried across the garden, holding a folded sheet of paper. "Sir, we found this tucked inside one of the doctor's medical books." Inspector Wallace unfolded it carefully. The page contained only a short list of names, written in Dr. Haydock's unmistakable handwriting. There were 6 names in total. 5 had been crossed out with neat pencil lines. 1 remained untouched. The final name was Leonard Ashcombe. The inspector looked up immediately. "Who is Leonard Ashcombe?" The constable consulted his notes. "He owns Ashcombe Farm, about 2 miles east of the village." "And has the doctor treated him recently?" "So far as we know." "No." Miss Marple remained silent, though the name stirred a distant memory, not of the man himself, but of something someone had once remarked during an afternoon sewing circle. It had seemed entirely trivial at the time. As Inspector Wallace slipped the paper into an evidence envelope, Miss Marple found herself thinking that lists rarely explained anything by themselves. They only reflected the intentions of the person who wrote them. The important question was not why Leonard Ashcombe's name remained uncrossed, but why the other 5 had disappeared from the doctor's concern. Somewhere within that quiet distinction lay the beginning of a pattern that no one else had yet recognized. Inspector Wallace wasted little time in seeking out Leonard Ashcombe. By mid-morning he and a constable had driven to Ashcombe Farm, where broad fields of barley shimmered beneath a bright sky that seemed strangely indifferent to the unease spreading across the district. Leonard was a sturdy man in his late 40s, whose weathered face suggested years of honest labor. He appeared genuinely surprised to receive the officers, and even more startled when told his name had been found among Dr. Haydock's papers. "I've nothing to hide," he said firmly. "Ask whatever you please." The inspector explained the circumstances. Leonard listened in silence before shaking his head. "I haven't seen the doctor in nearly 3 weeks. Were you expecting to?" "No." "Did you have any disagreement with him?" "Never." The answer came quickly, perhaps a little too quickly. Inspector Wallace studied him carefully. "Then why would Dr. Haydock Write down your name." Leonard rubbed the back of his neck. "I couldn't tell you." After a long pause, he added, "Unless it had something to do with my brother." The inspector's pencil stopped. "What brother?" "Thomas. He died last winter. Under the doctor's care." "Yes. What happened?" "Everyone said it was pneumonia." The inspector noticed Leonard's hesitation. "And you?" Leonard looked toward the fields outside the window. "I accepted what the doctor told me. But there are moments when a man wonders whether he accepted too easily." The remark lingered long after the interview ended. Meanwhile, the village had already reached its own conclusions. By lunchtime, Leonard Ashcombe's name was passing from house to house with remarkable speed. Shopkeepers lowered their voices whenever customers entered. Mothers interrupted conversations when children approached. The simple discovery of his name on the doctor's list had transformed him into the obvious suspect. Miss Marple observed the change with quiet concern. Nothing spread faster than certainty founded upon incomplete knowledge. That afternoon she visited the churchyard, where the vicar happened to be trimming roses beside an old stone wall. "A sad business," he sighed. "Very. I suppose poor Leonard will have an uncomfortable few days." "You expected his name to arise?" The vicar nodded slowly. "Not because I believe him guilty, but he carried resentment after his brother's death. I hadn't heard that. He never spoke publicly, yet once or twice I sensed disappointment. He wondered whether Thomas ought to have been sent to hospital sooner. Did he blame Dr. Haydock? I honestly don't know." Miss Marple thanked him before continuing along the church path. Human beings often mistook disappointment for hatred, she reflected. The two emotions resembled one another from a distance, but differed greatly upon closer examination. Later that day, she encountered Mrs. Ellis hanging washing behind her cottage. "My dear," Mrs. Ellis whispered before Miss Marple had spoken a word, "everyone says they've caught the man already." "Have they?" "Leonard Ashcombe. And what has he done?" Mrs. Ellis blinked. "Well, I don't exactly know, but everyone says he is responsible." "Yes," Miss Marple smiled gently. "It is extraordinary how frequently everyone knows something that no individual person can quite explain." Mrs. Ellis laughed uncertainly, realizing the truth of the observation. As evening approached, Inspector Wallace returned to Dr. Haydock's cottage to review the growing collection of evidence. He spread photographs across the dining table, muddy footprints, the discarded walking stick, the list of names, and sketches of the garden path. Everything appeared frustratingly disconnected. One photograph caught his attention. It showed the hallway floor where the footprints had been discovered. He counted them again. 2 distinct sets entered. 1 set departed. Yet something about their arrangement troubled him. Before he could identify the problem, Miss Marple arrived with a basket of fresh scones prepared. She explained, because policemen rarely remembered proper meals during investigations. The inspector accepted them gratefully. "You are most kind. I merely dislike seeing people attempt serious thinking on empty stomachs." He smiled. "I wish serious thinking solved cases. It occasionally helps." His eyes drifted back toward the photograph. "I keep feeling I've overlooked something." Miss Marple glanced only briefly at the picture. "The footprints. Yes, they seem rather neat. Most unexpected encounters produce confusion. Mud is carried in irregular directions. People hesitate, turn about, retrace steps. These appear almost orderly." Inspector Wallace leaned closer. She was right. The tracks formed surprisingly straight lines through the hallway. Very little wandering, very little hesitation, almost as though the people who made them already knew precisely where they intended to go. Before either could explore the thought further, a constable hurried through the front door carrying disturbing news. "Sir, we found Dr. Haydock." The room fell completely silent. "Where?" the inspector demanded. "In the abandoned gamekeeper's cottage near Blackwood Copse. Alive." The constable lowered his eyes. "No, sir." For a long moment, no one spoke. Miss Marple quietly folded her hands together. The disappearance had now become a murder investigation, and with that terrible certainty came another realization. Whoever had followed Dr. Haydock home had not acted in panic or impulse. They had planned each step with remarkable care, leaving behind just enough evidence to guide suspicion in the direction they had chosen, while concealing the one truth that mattered most. The abandoned gamekeeper's cottage stood at the edge of Blackwood Copse, half hidden behind overgrown brambles and neglected yew trees. Years earlier it had housed an elderly keeper employed by the estate, but after his death the building had slowly surrendered to damp, ivy and silence. Few villagers had reason to visit it now, making it an ideal place for someone who wished to avoid discovery. Inspector Wallace arrived shortly after sunset with several officers. The small cottage was lit by flickering lanterns whose pale glow scarcely penetrated the gloom. Dr. Haydock lay on the worn wooden floor near the cold fireplace. There were no signs of a violent struggle inside the room. His coat remained neatly buttoned, his watch was still in his pocket, and the chain around it had not been disturbed. At first glance, he might have appeared to be peacefully asleep, were it not for the unnatural stillness that no physician could ever mistake. The inspector removed his hat, respectfully. "This was no robbery," he said quietly. One of the medical examiners completed a careful inspection before rising. "There is a single wound at the back of the head. It was delivered with considerable force by a blunt object. No weapon, none that we can find." The officers searched every corner of the cottage. Dust covered nearly every surface except for a narrow path leading from the doorway to where the body had been placed. Curiously, there were remarkably few footprints inside, despite the recent rain softened earth outside. Whoever had brought Dr. Haydock there had either been extraordinarily careful or had taken unusual measures to conceal their movements. Inspector Wallace frowned. The killer planned this. No one disagreed. By the following morning, the dreadful news had reached every household in St. Emus. Mary Mead. Church bells sounded heavier than usual, and conversations that had once begun with weather or gardening now opened with hushed speculation about murder. The village seemed altered, as though an invisible shadow had settled over familiar streets. Doors that had always remained unlocked were now bolted before nightfall. Leonard Ashcombe learned of the discovery while repairing a fence. Before midday, 2 constables returned to question him again. This time they searched his farmhouse, examined his boots, and inspected every outbuilding. He submitted without complaint. "I understand why you're here," he said. Inspector Wallace appreciated the man's calmness but remained cautious. "Can anyone confirm where you were yesterday evening?" "My housekeeper left after supper, and afterward I was alone." The answer was truthful enough to be unfortunate. Meanwhile, Miss Marple visited the cottage of Mrs. Harmon, an elderly widow who possessed an astonishing memory for village routines. While sharing tea, Miss Marple guided the conversation toward Dr. Haydock's habits. "He always walked the same way home," Mrs. Harmon observed. "Always, unless called to a patient." "And did people know that?" "My dear, everyone knew it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Predictable habits often made crimes easier to arrange. Before leaving, she casually asked another question. "Did Dr. Haydock ever seem afraid?" Mrs. Harmon considered it carefully. "Afraid? No. Concerned." The widow hesitated, perhaps puzzled. "Puzzled by what?" "I couldn't say. About a fortnight ago I met him outside the bakery. He looked over his shoulder twice before crossing the road. I teased him about expecting highwaymen." "And what did he say?" Mrs. Harmon smiled faintly. "He laughed and answered, 'Not highwaymen, only memories.'" Miss Marple thanked her quietly. That curious remark lingered in her thoughts throughout the afternoon. Elsewhere, Inspector Wallace received the post-mortem findings. The doctor had died only a short time after leaving the church fete. There was no evidence that he had been killed inside his own cottage. More likely, he had been struck elsewhere before being transported to Blackwood Copse under cover of darkness. This created an entirely new problem. If Dr. Haydock had never been murdered inside his home, then the muddy footprints and open front door had been arranged afterward to support a false sequence of events. Someone had deliberately staged the cottage. When the inspector shared this conclusion with his officers, one young constable spoke hesitantly. Then perhaps the person who followed him home wasn't the killer. Inspector Wallace looked up sharply. Explain. If everyone was meant to believe the attack happened at the cottage, perhaps whoever followed him only wanted us to think they were important. The inspector stared silently at the maps spread across his desk. It was the first suggestion that truly challenged the entire investigation. That evening, Miss Marple stood outside her garden gate, watching the fading light settle across the village. Children no longer played in the lane. Even the usual laughter drifting from the public house seemed subdued. She found herself reflecting upon Dr. Haydock's curious words about memories. Memories could comfort, but they could also threaten. They survived long after people imagined old mistakes had been buried somewhere in St. Hepaw. Mary Mead lived a person who believed the doctor remembered something dangerous enough to kill for. Until she discovered what that forgotten memory was, every suspect, every footprint, and every carefully arranged clue would remain nothing more than shadows disguising the truth. 3 days passed without an arrest, and the confidence with which the villagers had first named Leonard Ashcombe as the murderer began to fade. Inspector Wallace had examined Leonard's boots and clothing, compared them with the footprints photographed at Dr. Haydock's cottage, and interviewed everyone who had seen him during the week before the fate. Although Leonard's inability to account for every hour of the evening remained troublesome, nothing connected him directly to the doctor's death. Reluctantly, the inspector admitted that suspicion alone could not sustain a prosecution. That conclusion did little to quiet village gossip. Instead, attention drifted toward other possibilities. Old disagreements that had once seemed trivial were suddenly treated as motives for murder. A merchant recalled arguing with Dr. Haydock over an unpaid account. A widow remembered the doctor advising her son against an unsuitable marriage. Every ordinary misunderstanding acquired sinister significance. Miss Marple observed the pattern with gentle sadness. Fear encouraged people to weave disconnected threads into elaborate tapestries, believing complexity itself to be proof. One afternoon she accepted an invitation from Mrs. Price Ridley, whose talent for collecting information rivaled that of the village post office. "I suppose you've heard the latest," Mrs. Price Ridley announced before the teacups had even been filled. "I've heard of several recent developments. This one concerns Mr. Edwin Mercer." Miss Marple searched her memory. Edwin Mercer was the quiet manager of the village bank, a courteous bachelor whose punctual habits had become almost legendary. What about him? He visited Dr. Haydock the morning before the fate. Was he unwell? Mrs. Price Ridley lowered her voice. "Apparently not. My cousin's daughter saw him leaving the surgery looking most distressed. Did she overhear anything?" "No, but she insists they were speaking rather sharply." Miss Marple thanked her for the information without expressing an opinion. Rumors frequently arrived dressed as facts, and one had to remove the embroidery before discovering the plain cloth beneath. Later that day she encountered Edwin Mercer locking the bank for the evening. He greeted her politely. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. You seem rather burdened today." He forced a smile. "I imagine everyone feels much the same." "Quite understandable." They walked together a short distance before Miss Marple remarked, as though recalling it only casually, "Dr. Haydock always spoke well of your reliability." Edwin stopped for the briefest instant. "He was very kind. I understand you visited him recently." A faint shadow crossed his face. "Only for a private matter. Nothing serious, I hope." "No, merely something personal." His answer was perfectly courteous, yet he ended the conversation almost immediately by remembering an appointment that could not possibly wait. Miss Marple watched him disappear around the corner. People eager to conceal guilt often talked too much. People protecting embarrassment generally talked too little. The distinction was subtle but important. Meanwhile, Inspector Wallace received another unexpected report from the laboratory. Traces of reddish clay had been found upon Dr. Haydock's coat. The soil did not match either the garden at his cottage or the ground surrounding Blackwood Copse. Someone had carried or taken him through an entirely different location before leaving his body. The inspector unfolded a county map across his desk. Only a handful of places near St. Mary Mead contained that distinctive clay. Ashcombe Farm was not one of them. For the first time, Leonard's position as principal suspect weakened considerably. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the doctor's cottage with Inspector Wallace's permission. Most rooms remained untouched since the official search. Books lined the study walls exactly as Dr. Haydock had arranged them, and his writing desk still held neatly stacked correspondence awaiting answers that would never be written. She wandered slowly, allowing familiar habits to guide her attention rather than deliberate searching. On the mantelpiece rested several framed photographs. One showed Dr. Haydock standing beside village cricket players many years earlier. Another depicted a harvest celebration. A third photograph had recently been removed. Its outline remained visible upon the dusty shelf, but the frame itself was gone. Miss Marple examined the pale rectangle left behind. "Curious," she murmured. There were no other gaps among the carefully arranged pictures. Someone had taken only that single photograph. When Inspector Wallace arrived a short while later, she pointed toward the empty space. Was a photograph listed among the missing items? He consulted his inventory. No, nothing of that sort. Then perhaps no one realized it had vanished. The inspector stared thoughtfully at the vacant place. If someone removed it after the murder, they considered it important or dangerous. He looked at her. "You believe the picture identified someone? I believe photographs preserve memories rather more faithfully than people do." As they stood silently in the fading light, Miss Marple became increasingly certain that the missing photograph had not been stolen because it possessed sentimental value. It had been removed because it contained something its owner never intended anyone else to examine closely. Somewhere within that forgotten image lay a face, a gesture, or a seemingly insignificant detail capable of unraveling every careful deception the murderer had constructed. Since the afternoon Dr. Haydock had walked home from the church fete, the discovery of the missing photograph altered the direction of the investigation more than Inspector Wallace cared to admit publicly. Until then, nearly every piece of evidence had pointed toward movements, footprints, and opportunities. Now there was the unmistakable suggestion that the murderer feared something preserved on paper rather than something left behind at the scene. He instructed his officers to question Dr. Haydock's friends about the photographs that had once decorated the study, hoping someone might remember the missing image. The answers proved frustratingly inconsistent. Mrs. Harmon believed it had shown members of the parish council after a charity fundraiser several years earlier. Colonel Bantry was convinced it had been taken during a cricket match. The vicar insisted it depicted a harvest supper in the church hall. Each witness spoke with complete confidence. Each contradicted the others. "It seems," Inspector Wallace remarked warily, "that memories are considerably less reliable than photographs." Miss Marple smiled. "Especially when people have not looked at the photograph for years. They begin remembering what they expect rather than what they actually saw." The inspector sighed. "I wish memories could be dusted for fingerprints." "They can," Miss Marple replied softly. He looked at her in surprise, only not by policemen. Later that afternoon she visited the lending library where Miss Emily Carter had served as librarian for almost 30 years. Few people appreciated how much a librarian noticed simply by observing who borrowed which books and how long they kept them. After discussing the weather and the latest arrivals, Miss Marple casually mentioned Dr. Haydock. "A terrible loss." Miss Carter nodded sadly. "He came here quite regularly." "Did he ever bring photographs?" "As a matter of fact, he did." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "Oh, only a fortnight ago." "What sort of photographs?" He was trying to identify the date of an old village celebration. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did you happen to see them?" "Only briefly." "Do you remember who appeared in them?" The librarian closed her eyes thoughtfully. "There were several people gathered outside the old assembly hall. I recall the doctor laughing because fashions had changed so much." "Anything else?" Summono, standing at the very edge of one photograph, had been partly hidden behind another person. "Did Dr. Haydock mention that?" "He did." What did he say? Miss Carter smiled faintly. He said it was remarkable how a person almost forgotten could still appear exactly where they ought not. Those words settled heavily in Miss Marple's thoughts. Exactly where they ought not. She thanked the librarian and walked slowly toward the village green, turning the sentence over repeatedly in her mind. It sounded less like an observation about photography and more like the beginning of a realization. Meanwhile, Inspector Wallace received another report from one of his officers. A local antiques dealer remembered selling an unusually heavy walking stick with a brass handle only weeks before the murder. The description closely matched the sort of object capable of inflicting Dr. Haydock's fatal wound. Unfortunately, the buyer had paid in cash and given no name. The inspector rubbed his forehead. Another promising clue that leads nowhere. His sergeant hesitated. Not nowhere, sir. What do you mean? The dealer recalls one unusual detail. Go on. He believes the purchaser was wearing gloves, despite the warm weather. Inspector Wallace made a note. It was a small detail, yet criminals often revealed themselves through habits that served no practical purpose. That evening, Miss Marple attended the Women's Institute meeting. Although conversation officially concerned preparations for the summer flower exhibition, the murder inevitably returned as the principal topic. Mrs. Price Ridley declared that the missing photograph undoubtedly contained the murderer's face. I should think that's obvious. Miss Marple shook her head gently. If that were so, the doctor would already have recognized the danger long ago. Then why steal it? Because something changed. The room grew quiet. Miss Marple continued almost absent-mindedly while arranging her wool. A photograph remains the same year after year. What changes is the understanding of the person looking at it. Several ladies exchanged puzzled glances. Only Mrs. Bantry seemed to grasp the point. You mean Dr. Haydock noticed something recently that he had overlooked before? Precisely. On her walk home beneath the soft evening sky, Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Harmon's curious account of meeting Dr. Haydock outside the bakery. Not highwayman. Only memories. At the time, the words had sounded mysterious. Now they suggested something entirely different. The doctor had not been haunted by a recent threat, but by an old event, suddenly viewed in a new light. Somewhere among forgotten celebrations, faded photographs, and ordinary village gatherings lay the single overlooked detail that transformed an innocent memory into a deadly secret. Whoever had followed him home must have realized that he had finally understood it, and had acted before he could share that understanding with anyone else. The following morning brought a steady rain that wrapped St. Mary Mead in a grey silence. The village lanes, usually alive with cheerful greetings, were nearly deserted as people hurried from one doorway to another beneath umbrellas. Miss Marple welcomed the weather. Rain had a curious habit of slowing conversation, encouraging people to think before speaking, and thoughtful remarks were often more valuable than excited gossip. She spent the early hours arranging old knitting patterns at her sitting-room table, though her attention rested elsewhere. One question continued to trouble her. If Dr. Haydock had only recently recognized something in an old photograph, why had he written down 6 names? 5 had been crossed out, leaving only Leonard Ashcombe. The list no longer seemed like one of suspects. Instead, it resembled a process of elimination. Shortly before noon, Inspector Wallace called at her cottage, carrying a leather folder thick with interview notes. I hoped you might help me make sense of these, he admitted. Miss Marple poured tea before opening the folder. What have you discovered? The missing photograph cannot be found anywhere. We've searched the doctor's cottage again, questioned his relatives, and examined every drawer and cabinet. Nothing. He paused before adding, We have, however, identified the occasion. Miss Marple looked up. It was taken 12 years ago during the reopening of the old assembly hall after its renovation. She nodded thoughtfully. A public celebration, almost the entire village attended, which makes it difficult. Very. The inspector removed a typed list. We've identified nearly everyone who appears in similar photographs from that day. Nearly. There are 2 people whose positions remain uncertain. because different witnesses remember different arrangements. Miss Marple accepted the paper. One name immediately caught her attention: Edwin Mercer. The other was a woman who had died several years earlier. She handed the list back without comment. "I wonder," she said quietly, "whether the doctor was interested in where people stood rather than who attended." Inspector Wallace frowned. "I'm not sure I follow. A photograph captures relationships as well as faces. Two people standing together may reveal more than either intended." The inspector considered the thought carefully. That afternoon, he arranged another interview with Edwin Mercer. The bank manager appeared composed, though noticeably tired. "You wish to see me again?" "I have a few additional questions." "Of course." Inspector Wallace mentioned the Assembly Hall celebration. Edwin smiled faintly. "That was many years ago. Do you remember being photographed?" "Vaguely." "Were you acquainted with Dr. Haydock then?" "We knew one another, as everyone did." The inspector watched him closely. "Did the doctor ever discuss that photograph with you recently?" A barely perceptible hesitation crossed Edwin's face. "No." "You are certain?" "Quite certain." The answer came smoothly, yet something about his expression suggested careful control rather than genuine confidence. Later that evening, Inspector Wallace described the interview to Miss Marple. He never contradicted himself. "No," he answered every question. "Yes." Yet I left feeling he had concealed something. Miss Marple smiled gently. "There is a great difference between concealing a fact and telling an untruth. What do you think he is hiding?" "I don't yet know." She rose and walked toward her window, overlooking the rain-darkened garden. "When I was younger," she said, "there was a curate who denied eating plum tarts before supper. Strictly speaking, he spoke the truth. He had eaten only one. Yet everyone listening believed he meant none at all." Inspector Wallace laughed despite himself. "I suppose precision can be deceptive." "Extremely." The following day brought an unexpected development. An elderly photographer from the neighboring town visited the police station after reading about the investigation. He explained that he had taken many village photographs over the years and occasionally kept glass negatives after printing copies. "I cannot promise anything," he said, placing a worn cardboard box upon the inspector's desk. "Most have deteriorated." Carefully, the officers examined the fragile negatives one by one. Several were cracked beyond recognition. Others had faded almost completely. Then one constable held a plate toward the light. "Sir," Inspector Wallace stepped closer. Although the image was faint, the outline of the assembly hall was unmistakable. A crowd stood smiling before the entrance. Near the edge of the picture, partly hidden behind another figure, appeared a man whose face could scarcely be distinguished. Yet what caught the inspector's attention was not the hidden man. It was Dr. Haydock himself. Unlike everyone else, he was not looking toward the camera. He was turning his head, staring directly at someone standing outside the photograph's frame. When Miss Marple studied the recovered negative later that evening, she remained silent for several minutes. The doctor had not been interested in the people captured within the picture. He had noticed the one person who should have been there but was somehow absent. That invisible presence explained why the missing print had become dangerous, why old memories had suddenly acquired new meaning, and why someone had felt compelled to silence him before he could discover what lay just beyond the edge of the forgotten image. Miss Marple asked Inspector Wallace to obtain every surviving photograph taken during the reopening of the Assembly Hall. The request puzzled him at first, but by the following afternoon, a small collection of faded prints had been gathered from family albums, parish records, and the local newspaper office. None was of exceptional quality, yet together they offered slightly different angles of the same celebration. The photographs were spread across a large dining table in the Bantry's drawing room, where Miss Marple examined them one by one through a small magnifying glass. She paid remarkably little attention to the smiling faces. Instead, she studied shadows, empty spaces, and the direction in which people happened to be looking. Mrs. Bantry watched with growing curiosity. "I should have thought the people were the important part." "They are," Miss Marple replied, "but not always in the obvious way." Colonel Bantry leaned over the table. I don't see anything unusual. Most mysteries, Miss Marple observed gently, remain invisible because everyone searches for what ought to be there, instead of noticing what is missing. Several minutes passed in silence. Then she placed 2 photographs side by side. In this one, she said softly, Dr. Haydock is looking away from the camera. Inspector Wallace nodded. We noticed that, in this second photograph, taken only moments later, he is smiling directly toward the photographer. What does that suggest? That whatever distracted him had disappeared almost immediately. The inspector considered the sequence. So someone moved, precisely. She pointed toward a narrow patch of gravel visible beside the assembly hall entrance. In the first photograph, this space is hidden by another person's shoulder. In the second, it is completely empty. There was someone standing there. I believe so. But why would that matter 12 years later? Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully, because Dr. Haydock finally recognized who that unseen person must have been. The inspector immediately ordered another review of the names connected with the celebration. Parish records, newspaper reports, and committee minutes were examined with renewed attention. One detail emerged that had attracted no notice before. A volunteer responsible for organizing the event had withdrawn at the last moment because of what was described merely as a family emergency. The volunteer's name was Edwin Mercer. Inspector Wallace stared at the document, but Mercer claimed only a vague memory of the celebration. He did, and according to this, he was deeply involved in arranging it. Miss Marple nodded quietly. A curious omission. That evening, the inspector invited Edwin Mercer to the station once more. The bank manager arrived looking pale, but outwardly composed. I understand you have further questions. I do. Inspector Wallace placed the committee record before him. You neglected to mention your role in the assembly hall reopening. Edwin glanced at the paper. It hardly seemed relevant. Perhaps not then. It was years ago. You also failed to mention withdrawing unexpectedly. A flicker of unease crossed Edwin's face. My mother was ill. We've checked. Silence filled the room. Your mother wasn't ill that week. Edwin's hands tightened almost imperceptibly. Inspector Wallace continued calmly. Can you explain the discrepancy? After several long moments, Edwin answered, I simply remembered it incorrectly. The explanation sounded rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Meanwhile, Miss Marple remained at home, quietly piecing together fragments of conversation gathered over the previous week. Dr. Haydock's remark about memories, the missing photograph, the crossed-out names, Leonard Ashcomb's connection through his brother, none of these pointed directly toward murder. They pointed instead toward recognition. The doctor had been identifying someone, not a stranger, someone he had known for years. Late that night, Inspector Wallace called upon Miss Marple. I cannot charge Mercer. No, I am convinced he's hiding something. So am I. But concealment is not murder. Miss Marple rose and walked to the fireplace. Tell me, Inspector, what became of Thomas Ashcomb's medical records? They're among the doctor's files. Have you read them carefully? We examined them for anything unusual. But did you compare them with the doctor's appointment book? The inspector looked puzzled. I don't believe we did. I think you should. He wasted no time returning to the station. Within an hour, a constable located the relevant documents. Thomas Ashcombe had supposedly been visited by Dr. Haydock on 3 consecutive evenings shortly before his death. Yet, the appointment diary showed the doctor attending an emergency in another village during one of those times. Someone else must have visited Thomas that night. Inspector Wallace stared at the conflicting entries in disbelief. The discrepancy seemed small, almost accidental, yet it suggested that a carefully accepted version of past events had been false from the beginning. As dawn approached, he realized Miss Marple had quietly uncovered the first genuine crack in the murderer's carefully constructed story. Whoever had followed Dr. Haydock home was not merely protecting a recent crime, but guarding a deception that had survived unnoticed for more than a decade, only to be threatened when the doctor finally recognized how one forgotten mistake connected the past to a murder in the present. Inspector Wallace returned to Miss Marple's cottage early the next morning, carrying Thomas Ashcombe's medical file, the doctor's appointment diary, and the recovered photograph. He placed them carefully upon her table. "You were right," he said. "The records don't agree." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and looked at the documents once more. "They were never meant to." The inspector frowned. "I believe I understand part of it, but not the whole." She smiled gently. "That is usually the way with puzzles. The final piece seems insignificant until it is fitted into place." She explained her thoughts slowly. 12 years earlier, Edwin Mercer had been standing just outside the photographer's frame during the Assembly Hall celebration. Dr. Haydock had glanced toward him because Mercer had arrived unexpectedly after claiming he could not attend. The incident had seemed trivial at the time. Only recently, while comparing old photographs, had the doctor realized that Mercer's account of that day had never been truthful. The false memory led him to reconsider another event involving Mercer. When Thomas Ashcombe became critically ill years later, the doctor's diary showed he had been called to an emergency in a neighboring village. Unable to attend personally, he had asked Edwin Mercer, then a trained volunteer with the local First Aid Society, to remain with Thomas until another physician could arrive. But Mercer told everyone the doctor had come himself. Inspector Wallace said quietly, "Yes," and Dr. Haydock accepted the misunderstanding. Until he reviewed his old notes, the inspector looked down at the file. Thomas wasn't neglected, no, but Mercer administered medicine without understanding the dosage. Inspector Wallace's expression hardened. The mistake hastened Thomas's death. It was a tragic accident. He nodded slowly. Then why commit murder now? Miss Marple folded her hands. Because Dr. Haydock finally understood the truth. His list of names was never a list of suspects. It was a list of everyone connected with Thomas's final illness. One by one he eliminated those who could not have made the fatal mistake. Only Edwin Mercer remained. The inspector immediately arranged for Mercer to meet him at the doctor's cottage, explaining only that another detail required clarification. Mercer arrived punctually, though his composure seemed unusually fragile. "I've answered every question," he said. "You have answered many." Inspector Wallace placed the photograph on the desk. Dr. Haydock recognized something in this picture. Mercer's eyes lingered on it. "I wouldn't know he recognized you." A long silence followed. Miss Marple spoke softly. "You believed the doctor had uncovered the truth about Thomas Ashcombe." Mercer's face lost its color. "I never meant to harm Thomas." "No." He became weaker so suddenly. "I thought another dose would help until the doctor returned." His voice trembled. "When I realized what I'd done," Dr. Haydock said, "there was no purpose in destroying another life." He allowed everyone to believe he had been present. Inspector Wallace listened without interruption. "For years," Mercer continued, "I tried to convince myself the matter was buried. Then he visited me the day before the fete. He asked whether there was anything I wished to tell Leonard Ashcombe." "You knew then," Miss Marple said, "that he had remembered." Mercer closed his eyes. "I couldn't bear it. Leonard would hate me. The village would despise me. Everything I'd built would disappear." "So you followed Dr. Haydock home?" "Yes, I intended only to persuade him to remain silent." We argued. He turned away, and I struck him with my walking stick. I didn't realize. His voice broke completely. I didn't realize the blow had killed him. He confessed to staging the doctor's cottage, discarding the walking stick, stealing the photograph, and moving the body to the abandoned gamekeeper's cottage in the desperate hope of directing suspicion elsewhere. Every carefully arranged clue had been born not from confidence, but from panic. When the confession ended, Inspector Wallace quietly placed Mercer under arrest. Several weeks later, peace gradually returned to St. Mary Mead. Shopkeepers resumed discussing ordinary matters. Children again filled the village green with laughter, and the church bells sounded less mournful than before. Leonard Ashcombe, though saddened by the truth surrounding his brother's death, found some comfort in finally knowing what had truly happened. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Bantry asked Miss Marple whether justice had been satisfying. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully across the blooming garden. "Murder is rarely the beginning of evil," she said. "More often, it is the last desperate attempt to hide a much older mistake." Had Edwin Mercer confessed his error years ago, he might have been forgiven. It was fear, not the accident itself, that finally destroyed him. She returned quietly to her knitting as swallows circled above the village, where life, as it always did, continued onward beneath the comforting appearance of perfect peace.